Good morning, dear students. We were talking about Victorian poetry and then pre-Raphaelite poetry. So in that, actually, in our last sessions, we were talking about D.G. Rossetti and his uh, help in the development of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And thereafter, we started discussing about uh, Christiana Rossetti, actually, and she helped a lot in the development of this pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And both of them actually, brother and sister, they were, both of them were dedicated very much for this movement that is known as pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. In the last slides and in our last session, we were discussing about Christiana Rossetti, and we could not complete that in that span of time. Now we would like to once again discuss about Christiana Rossetti. Rossetti sat for several of Dante's most famous paintings. In 1848, she was the model for the Virgin Mary in his first completed oil painting, the Girlhood of Mary Virgin, which was the first work to be inscribed with the initials PRB, later revealed to signify the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The following year, she modeled again for his depiction of the Annunciation, Esse Annuncia Domini, a line from her poem, Who Shall Deliver Me, inspired the famous painting by Fernand called I Lock My Door Upon Myself. In 1849, she became seriously ill again, suffering from depression, and sometime around 1857, he had a major religious crisis. So, actually, from the very beginning of this movement, she was very much associated with this pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Although Rossetti's popularity during her lifetime did not approach that of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, her standing remained strong after her death. In the early 20th century, Rossetti's popularity faded in the wake of modernism. Scholars began to explore Freudian themes in her work, such as religious and sexual repression, reaching for personal biographical interpretations of her poetry. So, as we can understand through the development of her poetic career, for the development of pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, that she was very much involved in different kind of literary genres for pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. But she could not reach the heights of Barrett Browning, actually, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, because both of them were almost contemporaries, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning was an outstanding poet of the Victorian poetry, and she was also an outstanding poet of, pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So that was there, but there is no doubt about it that Christiana was also one of the leading figures of pre-Raphaelite poetry. In the 1970s, academics began to critique her work again, looking beyond the lyrical romantic sweetness to her mastery of prosody and versification. So in 1970s, you see, academics they tried to criticize the work by Rossetti, actually, and they were talking about the prosody and versification in the poems of Christiana Rossetti. Feminists held her as a symbol of constrained female genius, placed as a leader of 19th century poets, and she was, respected by many contemporary critics, and they started calling her as a female genius, and she was a very important personality of that pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, actually. That was her status and her, dedication for pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So, as we have understood through our discussion and in our last sessions, in our last, discussions, we have tried to understand how Christiana Rossetti and how D.G. Rossetti helped in the development of pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, what the pre-Raphaelite was, and these people helped a lot. Her work strongly influenced the work of such writers as Ford Madox Ford, Virginia Woolf, G.M. Hopkins, Elizabeth Jennings, and Philip Larkin. So we can also very well see that she was a great influence on so many writers of the contemporary time, including Ford, Virginia Woolf, a very important and celebrated writer, and then once again G.M. Hopkins, who is known for sprung rhythm, and then Elizabeth Jennings and Philip Larkin, once again a very famous name. So, as a matter of fact, Christiana Rossetti was an important impact on very many leading figures of the contemporary literary world. Critic Basil de Salencourt stated that she was all but our greatest woman poet, incomparably our greatest craftswoman, probably in the first 12 of the masters of English verse. So people started calling her that she was the greatest personality, she was the greatest poet, and you see, she was a craftswoman also at the same time, and she was, you see, one of the 12 great masters of English literature and English poetry. So that was her place in English, you see, literature, and particularly at the time of the Victorian poetry, at the time of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and of course, she did a lot. She did a lot for the development of poetry and other genres as well. Rossetti's Christmas poem in the bleak midwinter became widely known after her death, when set as a Christmas carol first by Gustav Holst and then by Harold Darke. So particularly actually when we are talking about the poetry and particularly the quality of the verse that is found in the poetry of Christiana Rossetti. So that particular poem that is very much notable, that is very much noted for its, you see, religious qualities, and it has got the, you see, the qualities of a carol that is in the bleak midwinter, and that was very famous actually, and that was appreciated by very many critics. Her poem, her another poem, Love Came Down at Christmas. Love Came Down at Christmas, that was published in 1885, has also been widely arranged as a carol. So, this another poem actually that is entitled as Love Came Down at Christmas was also a very famous poem by the pen of Christiana Rossetti, and that has also got the qualities of a religious poem, that was a carol actually. So Rossetti is honored with a feast day on the liturgical calendar of the Anglican Church on 17th April. So as we have been talking about Christiana Rossetti in our last slides also, that she was a very celebrated poet, she was a dedicated poet, and who did a lot for the development of Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and particularly the poetry of the contemporary time. Next, after Christiana Rossetti, we would like to discuss about Oscar Wilde, one of the very famous writer of the contemporary time, who was born in 1854 and died in 19th century. He was an Irish writer and poet. After writing in different forms throughout the 1880s, he became one of London's most popular playwrights in the early 1890s. So, actually, he became a very famous playwright. He became a very famous playwright in 1890s actually. Very celebrated name. Today, he is remembered for his epigrams. He is remembered particularly for his epigrams. His novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, is a very important question. He is known for his epigrams and his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, his plays, and the circumstances of his imprisonment and early death. So, Oscar Wilde was also a very prominent figure in 19th century for particularly for the plays, and he also did a lot. He wrote a lot in the field of playwriting. Wilde's, if we consider about his family life, then his parents were successful Anglo-Irish Dublin intellectuals. His parents were intellectuals, and because as we have understood that he was an Irishman, and their son became fluent in French and German early in life. At university, Wilde read greats, and he proved himself to be an outstanding classicist, first at Dublin, then at Oxford. So as a matter of fact, he got a literary atmosphere. He got an atmosphere for literature in his home only, and there actually he tried to cultivate those feelings. He tried to develop those feelings on his own, and then actually he gave so many symptoms, so many, and he signified that he was also a great person. And then actually he proved himself to be a very good reader, a voracious reader, and he showed it first at Dublin and later on at Oxford. He showed it. He became known for his involvement in the rising philosophy of aestheticism. So later on he got involved in aestheticism, and he had the philosophy for aestheticism, and he is known for it, led by two of his tutors, Walter Pater and John Ruskin. Walter Pater, who himself is known for aestheticism actually, so he was very much associated with them, with Walter Pater and John Ruskin, and that is why he is known for the philosophy of aestheticism. After university, Wilde moved to London into fashionable cultural and social circles. So after that actually he moved to London. So through this much we can understand that he found an atmosphere for literature. He found an atmosphere for the literary development at his home only, and there he tried to develop himself, and there he showed his intellectual power, his literary power, and you see later on he got motivated towards aestheticism, and there also he did something. As a spokesperson for aestheticism, he tried his hand at various literary activities. He published a book of poems, lectured in the United States and Canada on the New English Renaissance and art. So as we were talking in the last slide, that he was very much, attracted. He got attracted towards aestheticism because of Pater and all, and then actually he became a spokesperson, and then actually he tried to do many things for aestheticism, and he published a book, and he lectured in the United States and Canada on the title of English Renaissance and Art. And then thereafter he came back to London, where he worked prolifically as a journalist. He also worked as a journalist actually, and known for his biting wit, flamboyant dress, and glittering conversation. Wilde became one of the best known personalities of his day. So he was a very famous journalist. He was known for his wit and dress, and for his conversations, for his glittering conversations he was known. And you see actually he was a very famous person. He was a very famous personality of the contemporary time, and actually he made himself a very successful person also. So later on, at the turn of the 1890s, he refined his ideas about the supremacy of art in a series of dialogues and essays, and incorporated themes of decadence, duplicity, and beauty into his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. The Picture of Dorian Gray, that was published in 1890, and about the Picture of Dorian Gray we discussed in our earlier slides also. So he is known for The Picture of Dorian Gray. Oscar Wilde is known for The Picture of Dorian Gray actually. As a matter of fact, he is known for his essays, and he is known for the series of dialogues and other things also. But particularly his popularity, the particular place lies in the popularity of The Picture of Dorian Gray. The opportunity to construct aesthetic details precisely and combine them with larger social themes drew Wilde to write drama. The opportunity to construct aesthetic details precisely. So actually, he through his works he tried to include the aesthetic matters, the aesthetic details in his dramas and in his novels. And he wrote Salome in 1891 in French in Paris, but it was refused a license for England due to absolute prohibition of biblical subjects on the English stage. So he wrote Salome also, but it was rejected, was not accepted as a matter of fact. Unperturbed, Wilde produced four society comedies in the early 1890s, which made him one of the most successful playwrights of the late Victorian London. So later on, when you see Salome was not accepted by the people, then he started writing four comedies. And the writing of four comedies, my dear friends, the writing, and through the writing of those four comedies, he became very famous. He was, you see, he was a very successful playwright in the contemporary time in London. So this is what was the popularity of Oscar Wilde actually. That time, at the height of his fame and success, while his masterpiece, The Importance of Being Earnest, this is another name, my dear friends, you must remember. This actually, The Importance of Being Earnest is a piece, is a masterpiece that is by the pen of Oscar Wilde, and that is a beautiful piece of writing by Oscar Wilde actually. That may be a question. Was still on stage in London, Wilde had the Marquess of Queensberry prosecuted for libel, and the Marquess was the father of Wilde's lover, Lord Alfred Douglas. The charge carried a penalty of up to 2 years in prison, you see, because of that rift and all. He was actually penalized, and he was, you see, he was behind bars for 2 years. The trial unearthed evidence and caused Wilde to drop his charges and led to his own arrest and trial for gross indecency with other men. After 2 more trials, he was convicted and imprisoned for 2 years hard labor. So, as we can understand actually, because of that, the charges that were put on Oscar Wilde were proved true, and he had to go behind bars, and he had to go behind bars. He had to go behind bars and do hard labor in the prison for 2 years, my dear friends. So this is what happened actually in his life. You see, and this is what happened when at the time when he was at the, you see, at the heights of popularity. He was at the heights of popularity, and he was at the apex of his popularity. So this is what happened actually that time, my dear friends. And later on, in 1897, in prison, he wrote De Profundis, which was published in 1905. You see, when he was in prison, he wrote De Profundis, and that was published in 1905, a long letter which discusses his spiritual journey, through his trials, forming a dark counterpoint to his earlier philosophy of pleasure. Upon his release, he left immediately for France. So, actually he wrote the letter, and in that letter actually he tried to discuss that what exactly happened, and he also wrote about his spiritual journey, that how he transformed himself and what were the problems and dilemmas actually, and how he made himself a spiritual personality, that he tried to discuss there. And later on, upon his release, he left immediately for France, never to return to Ireland or Britain, and because he was very much, you see, disappointed, or he was, you see, not satisfied with what happened with him. That is why he tried to, you see, immediately he left France. He tried to leave France that time, and he never came back to Ireland or Britain. There he wrote his last work, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, a long poem commemorating the harsh rhythms of prison life. He died destitute in Paris at the age of 46. So, my dear friends, actually we were talking that, you see, he was in prison, and once he was released, actually he came out, and then he went to France, and there actually, because the experiences of his prison life, the experiences of his life in the prison, he tried to discuss in the Ballad of Reading Gaol, and there actually he tried to explicate those moments, what exactly happened with him in the jail, that he tried to explain in this, you see, a long work. Though we would like to discuss now this poem actually that is in our syllabus, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. That is a ballad actually, it's a poem. The Ballad of Reading Gaol is a poem by Oscar Wilde, written in exile either in Berneuil-le-Grand or in Dieppe, France, after his release from Reading Gaol on or about 19th May 1897. So, as we were talking actually, the poem was written once when he was released actually, and he was somewhere in France. He was somewhere in France, and then he tried to write the poem actually. And this is all about his experiences in the prison. Wilde had been incarcerated in Reading after being convicted of homosexual offenses in 1895 and sentenced to 2 years hard labor in prison. So what exactly happened, you see, he was there, and the charges on him was of homosexuality, and you see. So during his imprisonment on Saturday, 7th July 1896, a hanging took place. Charles Thomas Buldridge had been a trooper in the Royal Horse Guards. He was convicted of cutting the throat of his wife, Laura Allen. Earlier that year, a clever near Windsor, he was aged only 30 when executed. So when he was in prison actually, somebody was sentenced to death. So that feeling also was there in his mind. Wilde spent mid-1897 with Robert Ross in Verneuil-le-Grand, where he wrote the Ballad of Reading Gaol. The poem narrates the execution of Buldridge. As a matter of fact, the poem narrates the execution of Buldridge. It moves from an objective storytelling to symbolic identification with the prisoners as a whole. No attempt is made to assess the justice of the laws which convicted them, but rather the poem highlights the brutalization of the punishment that all convicts share. Wilde juxtaposes the executed man and himself with the line, "Yet each man kills the thing he loves." Yet each man kills the thing he loves. Wilde too was separated from his life, from his wife and sons. Wilde too was separated from his wife and sons. He adopted the proletarian ballad form and suggested it be published in Reynolds magazine because it circulates widely among the criminal classes to which I now belong. For once I will be read by my peers, a new experience for me. So the Ballad of Reading Gaol actually talks about his experiences there and what the problems actually he shared with other people and his companions there. The finished poem was published by Leonard Smithers in 1898 under the name C.3.3, which stood for Cell Block C, Landing 3, Cell 3. This ensured that Wilde's name, by then notorious, did not appear on the poem's front cover. It was not commonly known until the 7th printing in June 1899 that C.3.3 was actually Wilde. It was a commercial success. Later on, it became a commercial success, that you see, initially he did not give his name, and Wilde did not give his name because of his dispopularity. He was not very much famous. But when the poem started getting popularity, commercial success, then going through 7 editions in less than 2 years, only after which Oscar Wilde, the name of the poet, was added to the title page. Though many literary circles had known Wilde to be the author, it brought him a little money. Yes, so because actually there were so many other people in the literary circles, they knew that it was the work of Wilde, but intentionally he did not do so. And he avoided writing his name, but later on when it became a successful name, then he started writing his name. So after discussing about Christiana Rossetti and Oscar Wilde and their works actually, now we would like to discuss about, the analysis of common themes in Victorian poetry, and hereafter we will be talking about the common themes in Victorian poetry. So here we go. Many of the themes and meanings of Victorian poetry reflect a conflicted sense of self. At once, Many poems by Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning portray a longing for the ideals of the romantic poetry, romantic period in literature, but they are instant. Yes. During the long reign of Elizabethan religious dissent was growing, and the church broke off into three distinct branches. This schism was also coupled with the fact that new discoveries were being made, most notably by the controversial theories of Darwin, but by other thinkers as well that argued for a more rational existence. Influenced by the works of Percy and Mary Shelley, Robert Browning already had aesthetic ideas, and although his feelings dissipated to some degree later in his life, his numerous criticisms of religion are obvious in the poem Fra Lippo Lippi, in which he tells the tale in form of a narrative poem, complete with slang and comedy of a man that was not destined to be in the church and chooses to heed his more physical impulses instead of conforming to the bill of the church. Browning seems to be engaging in the dialogue with the church regarding celibacy, both in the artistic and sexual sense. So actually, we were talking that you see this Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning were leading figures. And the feeling of the poem's narrators, the Fra Lippo Lippi by Browning, can easily be seen as Browning's own critique, and while the main theme concerns art, the strict sense in which the church views artistic pursuits and products is similar to the way it requires priests to live celibate lives. While the church's main argument is that art should be presented as something higher than the base representation of the human form, this denies the essential humanity of the subject, God's people. Along these same lines, the way the church frowns upon sexual, lustful activity on the part of its clergy by demanding celibacy is exactly the same request as for the artist. Both demands of the church, artistic and sexual, are idealized conceptions of how humans should be represented, and both, according to the narrator of the poem, are entirely unrealistic and misguided. Through this poem, Browning is arguing against mandatory celibacy for priests and is suggesting through the story and artistic struggle of Fra Lippo Lippi that the demands of the church go against human nature. So this is what actually was there in the poem. We are all to use Browning's word, beasts, thus prone to the same desires that the church besays to rub out. The narrator of this poem from the Victorian period argues that his life in cloister has been unnatural and restraining, and bemoans the lack of life he is allowed to experience. The mandatory celibacy is made even more absurd when the Fra point out, you should not take a fellow 8 years and make him swear to never kiss the girls. Earlier in the poem, he speaks of this in terms of other boys that had been brought into cloister by openly saying, Tres, such as these poor devils of Medici, have given their hearts to, all 8 years old. He seems to see this celibacy as a terrible waste of youth and life, both of which he values above all else. He seeks to represent truth through art, despite the fact that everything in his life is geared towards a completely celibate existence, both in art, sexuality, and life. The story of his life can be summed up in the simple phrase on line 221, rub all out, well, there is my life in short. He has been told to extinguish the art and the humanity, thus the keen sexual desire that longs to be free. This goes against human nature, an idea that was taking firm root after the more scientific observations about the self and the natural world, and thus religion is represented as the antithesis of all that is natural. What is most interesting about this religious criticism in the Victorian era, as seen in some of its poetry, is that there is also a certain yearning for the old days of religious order. For example, in sonnets from the Portuguese, Elizabeth Barrett Browning bemoans her loss of faith when she equates her lover as something she cannot quite grasp, something that is far away but familiar. The lost saints that once presided over her world. It is almost a romantic era poem, but in the last stanza, I love thee freely, as men strive for right. I love thee purely, as they turn from praise. Then goes on, I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. And the general tone of the poem indicates that there is something missing and remote about the speaker's existence. She is not quite connected with the world of God and saints, yet she is also not connected with the romantic ideas from earlier poetry. In true Victorian style, she seems unable to extricate religion from the picture. It is something she seems to yearn for, much like a lost or dead lover from glorious days gone by. The introduction to Victorian poets, it rather succinctly, as all of the Victorian poets show the strong influence of the Romantics, but they cannot sustain the confidence that the Romantics felt in the power of the imagination. Victorians often rewrite poems from the Romantic movement with a sense of belatedness and distance. One cannot help but wonder if it is the religious question that is perturbing their brilliance, or just a melancholy from the fast-paced, industrialized modern world that had sprung up in this era. So thank you, my dear friends. We have discussed about the Victorian poetry and its analysis also. Thank you very much.